I'm grateful to the organizers for inviting me and to Peter van Inwagen for many things on which I will dilate at dinner tonight if given a moment. But otherwise, my remarks will focus on matters on which we substantively disagree. Sometimes papers are coals to Newcastle, and other times they're Daniel in the lion's den. And this is the great lion's den of contemporary metaphysics, into which I enter with some trepidation. And I'm going to read a paper, something I haven't done in years, but after 2.5 years of PowerPoint in COVID, I am so sick and tired of it that I want to go back to the status quo ante. A set of experiences that Peter and I had over the years, and which enabled us to learn to follow relatively complicated arguments. Over the years, I've been convinced by a number of arguments to adopt views that at first I rejected quite strongly. Among the conclusions I have come to accept as a result of what I think of as very successful arguments, there are two that come immediately to mind. I have been an incompatibilist ever since reading Peter van Inwagen's essay on free will. I've been an eliminativist about everyday objects ever since reading Material Beings. I consider the arguments of these two works to be paradigmatically successful. I was therefore disturbed to find that Peter himself holds that most philosophical arguments are failures. This is a claim that he makes in the Gifford Lectures, The Problem of Evil, in which he hopes to show that this argument against theism is a failure. I took some consolation in the thought that if the argument from evil against God's existence is a failure, it's at least in good company. Peter's argument that most philosophical arguments are failures comes with some interesting qualifications and conditions. Subject to these qualifications, he believes all philosophical arguments are failures. Peter begins by exempting what he claims to be arguments for minor philosophical theses from his verdict of failure. Examples include Getier's argument that knowledge isn't justified true belief. More generally, he sets aside arguments that offer counterexamples, identify exceptions to generalizations, or reveal non sequiturs, as they do not sustain, quote, substantive philosophical theses. In The Problem of Evil, he doesn't use the word positive to describe the philosophical theses he believes have no successful arguments, but he does so elsewhere. Roughly, a positive thesis is one for which there is a set of considerations that philosophers would identify as a theory. So the denial of a philosophical thesis could be a positive thesis if it came along with a theory. Peter gives examples. Theism is false is a positive philosophical thesis because it and its negation are theories. Utilitarianism is false is not a positive thesis since it makes no commitment to some other more distinct ethical theory. A second class of arguments explicitly to be exempted from Peter's claims are ones in or about mathematical logic and metamathematics, including Gödel's incompleteness results. These proofs, he writes, establish that formalism about mathematics is false, and this is not a substantive philosophical thesis, even as its denial is one. Presumably, formalism is false is like utilitarianism is false. It does not commit one to a particular account of the nature of mathematical truth. Still another class of arguments to be excluded are those offered against skeptical conclusions that have been embraced or entertained sincerely or perhaps disingenuously on the basis of clever arguments by philosophers going back to Zeno. Quote, and this is from Peter, arguments for the reality of motion, the reliability of induction or sense perception, or the existence of an external world or other minds. Is it because these arguments, like Getier's, mainly proceed by counterexamples and the like, and like his are therefore minor philosophical theses? In thinking about this class, I'm struck by the fact that the skeptical arguments whose conclusions these arguments repudiate are among the most successful in our profession, at least in their notoriety and resistance to sophistical refutation. Thus, I refute Bishop Berkeley is not a successful argument by any stretch of the imagination. Putting these exceptions aside, Peter offers a standard for successful philosophical argument against which he then measures the argument from evil. The standard he advances is as follows. An argument for P is a success, just in case it can be used under ideal circumstances to convert an audience of ideal agnostics with respect to P, to believe in P in the presence of an ideal opponent of belief in P. Peter considers this standard the weakest, most liberal standard that can be constructed for successful philosophical arguments, the most possibility of success friendly. Some may dissent from this criterion simply on the grounds that its forensic character is inappropriate for disinterested inquiry. Where forensic debate is appropriate, parties are concerned to win an argument. In philosophy, it may be held that the parties seek agreement on conclusions all parties can endorse. We may well agree that this has not happened often, if at all, in respect of positive philosophical theses. We may consider why hereafter. Peter does consider two other standards for success that are, in his view, too stringent to be accepted. The first, adapted from Plantinga, requires of a successful argument that it reasoned from premises almost no sane, rational person would doubt, by logical steps equally undisputed by almost no sane, rational person, to its substantive, non-minor philosophical conclusion. The second candidate for a criterion of philosophically successful argument that he rejects requires for the success of any argument that P, that it be powerful enough to convert an ideal opponent of the thesis that P into a proponent of that thesis. Ideal opponents and ideal opponents of philosophical theses will be of the highest possible intelligence, logical acumen, and intellectual honesty, unlimited patience, and time to treat one another's arguments. These two standards are rejected by Peter for the same reason. They are too stringent. They consign most, if not all, arguments for substantive philosophical conclusions to failure. Of course, it doesn't escape Peter's notice that the criterion that he endorses as the most liberal criterion possible has the same feature. It too can't be satisfied by any argument for a positive philosophical conclusion. But I cannot find in Peter's argument for his criterion any discussion of why his criterion is, as he writes, the most liberal possible criterion. One consideration that might support this claim that I think we can exclude is the notion that anything more liberal would allow a successful, a valid argument from false or doubtful premises that less than ideal reasoners, disputants, and agnostic auditors are unable to detect. Peter has already accepted this possibility as characterizing his criterion when he relativizes the ideal of agnostics, agnostics to cognitive agents of our, quote, culture and our times and to what we know, or as he notes, quote, what we think we know today. So a successful argument by his standards might still fail to be sound. There are many ways to weaken Peter's preferred criterion for success and many alternative weaker criteria that might be mooted. For example, we might reduce the ideality and increase the realism of Peter's disputants, Peter's agnostics, and the circumstances of Peter's debate. These weakenings and others would perhaps allow as successful arguments once Peter and many others are prepared to reject. We might not wish to endorse any of these weakenings owing to their liberality, but we won't be able to cite their fallibility as a basis to express a preference for Peter's proposal over these more liberal ones. As just noted, Peter's criterion for a successful philosophical argument invokes four ideal kinds: ideal proponents of P and ideal opponents of P, ideal agnostic auditors of their arguments and counter-arguments, and ideal circumstances of the debate between them. An ideal agnostic with respect to P is a cognitive agent who neither accepts P nor accepts its denial, but who has a sincere interest in establishing the truth or falsity of P. But what and how much does the ideal agnostic know in general and know about P itself? Peter relativizes ideal agnostics to our culture and our times and to what we know, or as I said before, what we think we know today, including, as he instances, current scientific knowledge. So there will be limits to what any ideal agnostic knows. Does this relativization extend to current cognitive capacities and logical perspicacity? Peter's jury of agnostics won't have to assess the arguments to be examined for validity. Validity is stipulated by both proponents and opponents of the argument. But agnostics will have to assess the validity of arguments for and against the original premises. We are better at this than in the past, owing to advances in logic, but participants in our culture and our times are probably not yet logically infallible. Consider the debate about Peter's use of principle beta and its revisions. So the ideality of the ideal agnostics does not extend to relevant omniscience and logical infallibility. Nor can ideal agnostics' agnosticism be owing to its having already heard all the arguments pro and con P and rightly concluding that they cancel each other out. Are ideal agnostics ideally rational and ideally patient? I think Peter supposes them to be, but it is hard to combine such attributes with those of our culture and our times. Thus relativized, how ideal are these agnostics, and how closely can real philosophers attain to their ideality? We'll explore this matter below. As Peter describes his ideal agnostics, they will all be epistemically identical to one another with respect to P, all being exposed and equally attentive to the same argument. If the argument for P therefore succeeds in convincing one of them that P is true, given their homogeneity, surely it will have succeeded in convincing all of them that P is true. It turns out that convincing just one ideal agnostic is as decisive as convincing any number, no matter how large, of other ideal agnostics. A successful argument converts an audience of ideal agnostics under ideal circumstances. Converting an audience is to be achieved by winning an ideal debate conceived on a forensic model in which proponents and opponents use every means possible to convince not one another, but the audience of agnostics to surrender their agnosticism. They have world enough and time to do so in these ideal circumstances. Peter stipulates that all arguments offered in the debate on behalf of proponents of P and its opponents are logically valid. Accordingly, the debate consists entirely in disputes about the truth values of some or all of the premises of the arguments offered pro and con. Should we extend the stipulation of validity to all the counter-arguments offered by each disputant against the arguments of the other disputant? Why not? Peter holds that at least sometimes, perhaps often, real-world arguments about positive philosophical theses come close to being ideal, that the actual circumstances, the agnostics, and the arguments deployed approach those stipulated in his criterion for successful argument. And he then argues inductively that no actual philosophical argument has ever been given succeeds by the standards of his proposed criterion. The induction proceeds through examination of one case, in fact, from his own experience regarding an argument that I have already said I count as successful, his argument for incompatibilism. The arguments from An Essay in Free Will have been, as he says, quote, tested in several iterations of graduate seminars in several universities. The graduate students participating in these seminars come close enough, in Peter's view, to ideal agnostics, and the structure of the seminars come close enough to the ideal circumstances of a forensic debate to provide evidence for or against the success of Peter's arguments by the standards he sets. He writes, quote, "The outcome of this test is as predictable as it was disappointing. Some of the graduate students were convinced by my arguments, and some of them were not," end quote. In Peter's view, there's nothing special about his argument for incompatibilism. The same fate has and will befall any other argument in philosophy. None will be successful, and no philosophical question of importance will ever be answered. And here's a long passage I quote from Peter. It is implausible to suppose that philosophy should be able to answer the question, are thoughts events in the brain, but no other substantive philosophical question. It is implausible to suppose that philosophy should ever be able to answer the question, does mathematics treat of an objective reality that exists independent of the physical world, but no other successful question. One would expect that either philosophy would be able to answer lots of questions that philosophy has posed, or else would be able to answer none of them. Now, it seems patent to me that discussion of Peter's consequence argument as amended in subsequent works for incompatibilism in their actual settings was very far from the one required to test the success of those arguments. This is not just for the reason notes that the students were not all initially neutral as regards the compatibility of free will and determinism, and that an advocate of compatibilism as the least as resourceful in debate as Peter was not present to present arguments for compatibilism and counter-arguments against incompatibilism. There are several other reasons to think that none of these venues came close to the ideal circumstances of a forensic debate between ideal disputants seeking to convince ideal agnostics. There are several social and psychological factors at play in any graduate seminar that would deform the avowals of those who must approximate to Peter's ideal agnostic auditors. In particular, the context of a real actual graduate seminar of the sort Peter instances is one in which no matter how convinced a student might be about the soundness of an argument, especially as advanced by the instructor, there are many incentives vocally to dissent from it and actively to seek considerations that militate against it. Even among those who endorse the conclusions, there will be rewards for identifying countervailing but mistaken considerations that need to be addressed for the argument to succeed by Peter's standards. Additionally, as Peter notes, to employ his standards requires, quote, unlimited leisure and superhuman patience, neither of which is distantly approached in a philosophy graduate seminar. Insofar as these considerations attend the treatment of other philosophical questions, such as the ones Peter instances, are thoughts events in the brain? Does mathematics treat of an objective reality that exists independent of the physical world? Insofar as these considerations attend the treatment of such questions in graduate seminars, or for that matter in postdoctoral seminars, the evidential ground for his pessimism about all philosophical arguments seems weak, inductively weak. I think we should reject his claim that all philosophical arguments, or that at any rate all philosophical arguments that have attracted the attention of philosophical community, have been tested under circumstances that approximate sufficiently to the circumstances of an ideal debate. It might turn out that for all cognitive agents of our culture and our times know, there are several arguments for significant philosophical theses that might satisfy the stringent standards of Peter's criterion. Our debates don't come close to attaining those standards and so provide no adequate test of whether there are arguments unknown to us that might do so for significant theses of interest to us. Many philosophers will have a motive for dissenting from Peter's claim and or rejecting his criterion of success. After all, what if our discipline cannot even in principle even produce arguments that satisfy a substantial criterion for success? What if we cannot produce positive theses that come with theories all or most qualified philosophers will agree to at the end of inquiry? What then, it may well be asked, is the point of philosophy at all? Is it, and here I quote Locke, quote, ambition enough to be employed as an underlaborer in clearing the ground a little and removing some of the rubbish which lies in the way to knowledge, end quote? Those with a motive to circumvent Peter's conclusions about arguments and to seek a criterion that permits them to do so may begin with an admission he makes, perhaps casually, in the course of offering inductive evidence that no philosophical argument satisfies his criterion. He writes, quote, there are certainly successful arguments, both in everyday life and in the sciences. But are there any successful arguments in philosophy, end quote. Where does the difference lie between everyday life and the sciences on the one hand and philosophy on the other that makes successful arguments attainable in the former domains and not in the latter? I am actually indifferent to whether there are successful arguments in everyday life or what they could be. The fact that we still teach arguments for Cartesian skepticism and Berkeleian idealism suggests that there may not be successful arguments for the everyday belief in the existence of the external world, probably the most obvious of everyday beliefs. Between them, Peter and Peter Unger have undermined several other everyday claims for which there might be supposed that there were successful arguments. But there are successful arguments in science and mathematics. Some of them may reach conclusions that even come close to satisfying criteria of success that Peter considers more stringent than his own most possible of success-friendly criterion. Consider how closely the process of certifying a scientific theory or finding comes to standards of convincing an ideal opponent, the stronger criterion that Peter rejects. The argument for the general theory of relativity has converted almost all of the opponents of its conclusion into proponents under conditions and circumstances that approach much more closely to the ideal than anywhere else in inquiry, including philosophy graduate seminars, notwithstanding the general theory's incompatibility with quantum mechanics. The case may be even more compelling in mathematics. Weyl's proof of Fermat's last theorem was subjected to such scrutiny by so many mathematicians that the argument came much closer than philosophy to converting ideal opponents into proponents. Peter himself instances some of the conclusions of some of the successful arguments in a variety of works, among them arguments for various physical theories, and for several findings in physics. The expansion of the universe is speeding up and has a finite beginning in time. These seem to be examples that Peter cites. He also endorses conclusions such as Darwin's for the theory of natural selection and for the evolution of most of life on Earth. So I presume he considered the arguments offered by Darwin and his successors for these claims to be successful. But perhaps he considers them only good arguments, as he considers some of his own and other philosophers to be merely good arguments. What makes these arguments successful, the arguments in physics and in biology? My own view is that the most successful arguments in science are ones for claims that seem successively to converge over time. Well-established scientific theories begin by showing consilience with one another, a consilience that often gives way to a convergent reduction. So the history of physics shows a smooth reduction of mechanics from Newton's laws and Maxwell's equations to more predictively accurate theories that include the earlier theories of special cases and empirically well-confirmed approximations. This history accumulates the strong evidence for earlier theories along with the newly uncovered evidence of their inaccuracies as revealed by their successors, and even more strongly supports later physical theories. This is in large part what makes the arguments for the later theories successful. Of course, this process reveals that each of the earlier theories was strictly false and shown to be such through corrections guided by the later theories. This fact provides inductive evidence that our current theories are also false and likely to be corrected hereafter. In fact, we can be sure of this for at least one of the two cases of quantum mechanics and the general theory of relativity, despite the success of the arguments for them, as they are logically incompatible with one another. Accordingly, I'm committed to the view that a successful argument in science need not, indeed has never established the truth of its conclusion. Demonstrated truth of conclusion is too demanding a standard for success in scientific argument. Being on the right track towards a truth about factual matters characterizes successful science and vindicates the empirical methods it employs to certify some of its arguments as successful. I think for a recent articulation of this view, we can see Strevens as the knowledge machine. I appreciate that this view about successful arguments for science leaves some hostages to fortune against scientific realism. But these are matters that leave scientists themselves untroubled. The ever-increasing number of successful arguments in science, employing the same empirical methods broadly understood, delivering increasingly precise and increasingly broad explanations confirmed by observational and experimental an experiment suggests a philosophical thesis about scientific truths that David Chalmers has articulated and that I endorse. The scrutability thesis is what he calls it. All truths are entailed by fundamental empirical truths concerning the fundamental natural properties and laws. The sciences have, collectively and individually, managed to accumulate an impressive set of successful arguments for conclusions that inductively validate the scrutability thesis, even as their conclusions raise even more and more difficult to answer questions every time they're accepted. The more we know, the larger the identifiable extent of our ignorance of nature. It's the convergence, however, of the rigorous application of scientific method on answers to questions, often required, often demanded by their opponents, that encourages us to treat many of the arguments for these answers as successful. The degree of convergence on answers to important questions in the natural science has been so great that the success of the arguments for them approaches to the standard that Peter rejects as too stringent for philosophy. A successful argument that P is powerful enough to convert an ideal opponent of the thesis that P into a proponent of this thesis, a stronger thesis than the one that he imposes about ideal agnostic auditors. Convergence in science is obviously to be contrasted with the lack of it in philosophy. Whitehead once said that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists in a series of footnotes to Plato. He was literally correct in that several of our most vexing problems in contemporary philosophy are ones that identifiably daunted Socrates and his interlocutors in the Platonic dialogues. Not much convergence in philosophy. Chalmers canvasses several considerations that militate against convergence in philosophy. Some identify features of our discipline we'd all recognize. And now I'm going to go through his catalog. Anti-realism. The domain of moral philosophy is one in which the lack of convergence has, in the recent past, certainly been explained by varieties of anti-realism. Non-cognitivism, sentimentalism, error theory have all sought to explain the ages-long persistence of disagreement by denying that the conclusions of any argument in the domain of ethics are truth-apt. But this approach is not one favor when generalized to other subdomains of philosophy. Almost all the rest of the discipline treats claims that very much look like they are truth and falsity apt. Verbal disputes. Chalmers believes that there are many verbal disputes in philosophy. Participants are talking past each other. But as he recognizes, this can't be an impediment to convergence in every case, or even in many important cases. Much work in philosophy is devoted to conceptual clarification that reduces verbal disputes. For 2,000 years or so, we have been refining and precisifying the terms in which Plato framed the disputes he sought successful arguments to resolve with little appreciable progress. Greater distance from the data. Philosophy tends to concern domains that are remote from clear data. The trouble with this explanation is apparent from the contrast with natural science, in which convergence has accelerated as the degree of unobservability of the explanatory variables of most domains has increased. In some areas, such as quantum mechanics and high-energy physics, distance from the data is very great and increasing without explanatory divergence. There are currently intractable disputes about the nature of the explanatory variables in these subdisciplines of physics, but this doesn't undermine the convergence on the truth of the conclusions of arguments deemed successful in these fields. In philosophy, these persistent arguments about what counts as data, which plainly exacerbate any prospect of data's resolving disputes and fostering convergence. Sociological explanations. Chalmers suggests that the difference between the social institutions' mores and norms of science and philosophy, the real reward structure of the two disciplines, differences in training, funding and research organizations, individual versus research teams, labs, and groups, that these foster convergence in science and discourage it in philosophy. But as he recognizes this can't be the whole story or even much of the story, I'm disposed to think that it isn't even much of the story because a half-century of the strong program in the history of science and its successors have revealed how great are the roles of social forces in shaping scientific debates. Think of evolutionary biology from the meeting of the British Association in 1860 to the rewards showered on Stephen Jay Gould for disagreeing with E.O. Wilson in the sociology debates of the 70s. And yet, at the end of the day, there is convergence on conclusions in science in spite of these deforming forces. Wilson won. Psychological explanations. There's something distinctive about the human mind or about philosophers' minds that prevent convergence on philosophical questions. This explanation raises several questions hard to answer. How are philosophical questions distinctively different from other questions that make them harder for us to answer? And exactly what are the limitations on our cognitive powers that make them intractable for us? When I consider the genius of the great philosophers, I find this explanation for the lack of convergence particularly weak. Scientific questions that have looked intractable for long periods, the anomalies of the Kuhnian paradigm, have succumbed to genius, to effort, to serendipity. But we philosophers haven't moved much beyond Plato, employing the same level of cognitive powers as have moved science to persistent and substantial convergence over the same time. Evolutionary explanations, another of Chalmers' considerations. Our cognitive powers, and of course others have brooded this about as well, our cognitive powers are the result of selection over long periods that goes back into the phylogenetically deep past. Among the environmental factors that shaped, constrained, and selected for our contemporary cognitive equipment, there was almost no selection for ability to track philosophical truth or construct arguments that would succeed in converging on it among agents of our cognitive powers. I find this explanation particularly weak. To begin with, natural selection has never tracked truths in its selection of any of our beliefs. Indeed, many of the beliefs that we have been selected for endorsing have been shown by what I think of as good arguments in science and philosophy to be false. For example, our belief that things are colored, or that they're smooth, or that they're solid. Our abilities to produce convergence in science and to hit upon the mathematics that we have required in order to achieve this convergence are evolutionary spandrels, byproducts of selection on traits of immediate selective advantage. There's no particular reason why an inability to do philosophy successfully should not also have been, why an ability to do philosophy successfully should not also have been a similar byproduct result of selection on cognitive traits and powers that confer advantage, provided a benefit, met a need in the evolutionary process. These considerations do not adequately identify the difference between science and philosophy that will explain the failure of our discipline to converge on significant truths by successful arguments in the way that science has done. But there is one more factor Chalmers notes as a force that does explain the failure of philosophy to converge on truths in the way the empirical sciences have. It's a feature that I have long myself argued provides a tendentious and yet fully encompassing definition of philosophy. It's one that unifies all the heterogeneous questions philosophers address into ones with a recognizably single discipline distinct from all the other ones. Chalmers calls this seventh feature of philosophy that prevents convergence disciplinary speciation. What he calls disciplinary speciation is what I call the history of philosophy, or at least of Western philosophy. From the time of Plato onward, each of the disciplines that characterizes Western science and mathematics has separated itself from philosophy. The process began with Euclid and slightly later with Archimedes, making mathematics a separate discipline in the 3rd and 2nd century BCE. Physics didn't fully separate itself until the scientific revolution of the 17th century, and chemistry a century or so after that. After 1859, with the publication of On the Origin of Species, Darwin turned the discipline of biology from a combination of philosophical theology and stamp collecting into a science. If computer science is a science, it separated itself from philosophy in the lifetimes of some of us here. Somewhere Peter once said that any discipline with the word science in its name isn't a science at all, mortuary science. Psychology has almost, but not quite, finished the job of slipping entirely free from philosophy as well. So the explanation of non-convergence in philosophy is simple. Every time a discipline, a sub-discipline of philosophy begins to make progress, to converge on results by arguments that the subspecialists agree are successful, the discipline turns its back on philosophy and proceeds along the path marked out by its initial success and the methods employed to attain these initial successes. Whence the lack of convergence in philosophy. Convergence has been defined away by the successive narrowing of our discipline to exclude areas just where convergence in them begins to be possible. Chalmers finds disciplinary speciation at least an incomplete explanation of the lack of convergence. The problem as he sees it is this, and here I quote from David: "The relative lack of convergence on philosophical questions is presumably explained by something distinctive about these questions in their relation to us. We can then ask what distinctive feature or features of these questions explains the lack of convergence. Speciation does not have the power to answer the question," end quote. Not by itself, but speciation together with a few further considerations unenumerated in the rest of Chalmers' list does suffice to answer the question. First, we should note that each of the disciplines from math in the 3rd century to psychology in the 20th and 21st centuries leaves questions that look like they pertain to each of the disciplines, unanswered and to be addressed pretty much only by philosophers. Moreover, the absence of answers to these questions in the disciplines does not seem to impede their progress or their convergence on answers. Mathematics is about numbers, but it leaves to philosophy the question, what is a number? This is a question, the answer to which mathematics seems to have no need to provide, and no means to provide it either. Since Newton, we've accepted F equals ma and that a equals dv dt, the derivative of velocity with respect to time. But since Newton, physics has not successfully addressed the question of what time is. Many questions about time, such as why it seems to us to flow in one direction, have been addressed, some successfully, but not this obvious one, what is time? Darwin's achievement was in part of great interest in philosophy because unlike Euclid's and Newton's, Darwin has been taken by many to show how some questions which philosophy had claimed the exclusive purview to address should in the end be addressed by empirical science. The history of science as the thankless children of philosophy suggests a definition of philosophy that enables us to see why it's a single unified discipline despite the heterogeneity of its questions, why it lacks convergence on answers to them, and why there are no successful arguments in philosophy. The definition suggested is that philosophy addresses two kinds of questions. First, the questions that the sciences cannot answer, and by the sciences I mean the physical, biological, behavioral, and social, and cannot even answer at the end of inquiry. And the second set of questions, why there are questions in the first set of questions at all. One consideration strongly supporting this tendentious or at least persuasive definition of philosophy is that it synthesizes the four apparently disparate domains, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and logic, into one unified subject. it answers the question what these four have to do with one another that makes each the compartment of a single discipline. If philosophy is the discipline that addresses questions not answerable by the science, then it will be then it will be evident that it answers all and only the questions which cannot be answered by the broadly empirical, experimental, observational method of knowledge acquisition that characterize the sciences. These two sets of questions will perforce be questions on which the empirical tools of science are unavailable to forge convergence, and the mathematics and the methods of mathematics haven't done so either. But what if the epistemic tools of empirical science and mathematics are the only tools that produce knowledge? What if every currently vexing philosophical question to which there is ultimately an answer to be found, on which inquiry will eventually converge, is one that succumbs ultimately to empirical inquiry? The mind-body problem seems an apt example of such a problem. We are at present in no position to solve this problem. Indeed, if Nagel is right, we don't even understand what would constitute a physicalist solution to the problem. But unless we take current conceivability as our standard for possible solutions to problems, we are in no position to rule out an empirical one. And a great deal of contemporary philosophical effort should be seen as directed at fostering an empirically driven answer to this question, the mind-body question. Many philosophers will find fatuous this suggestion that all the problems of philosophy will succumb to scientific and mathematical inquiry. But those philosophers will need to explain why these questions that remain at the end of scientific inquiry are not pseudo-questions of the sort that the logical positivists used to instance. Did the universe and everything in it just double in size? Such a question will have no answer on which inquiry can converge, though there may be a diagnosis of what cognitive mistakes make people suppose that it's a real question. The older among us are all familiar with a period in the past when philosophy's main function was deemed to be the analysis of whether and why some questions were unanswerable just because they were pseudo-questions, language on holiday, in Wittgenstein's words. Might some or all of these questions remaining at the end of empirical and mathematical inquiry be of this sort, fodder for successful minor philosophical arguments? It's impossible at this stage of the accumulation of scientific knowledge to identify any philosophical question on which there is so far no convergence as definitely a pseudo-question. But there are some candidates I find attractive. I wonder why mathematics has been able to advance so far in 2,500 years with no need for agreement on what a number is. It seems plausible to me to conclude that answering this question will never advance mathematical knowledge in the slightest. This makes it tempting to suggest that the metaphysician's question does not identify a real problem on which any convergence can be sought or expected. Another example of a question I'm tempted to stigmatize as a pseudo-question is the one that Chalmers has concerned himself with. What is the intrinsic nature of matter? Following Russell and other philosophers, it has been held that physics and science more generally can only identify structural relations between chunks of matter, but can't identify the intrinsic, essential, non-relational properties of matter. If this is so, one option is, following Chalmers, to suggest that its intrinsic nature might be psychical. But another option is to treat the question of the intrinsic nature of matter as a pseudo-question. When at the end of inquiry we know all the relational truths about matter and energy so that we can predict and explain its distribution at any time through the history of the universe, it is an open question whether an answer to the intrinsic nature question will add anything to our knowledge. If it doesn't, then it's not a real question at all, and failure to converge on an answer to this question will not be troubling. If we adopt this approach, we may be confident that there will be convergence on all real philosophical questions that philosophy addresses. At the end of inquiry, there will be successful arguments to conclusions we currently identify as positive significant philosophical theses and their associated theories. It's just that they won't still be labeled philosophical when they are ultimately agreed to by those qualified to assess them. Remaining questions won't be outstanding philosophical issues either, as they will all be either ones answered by minor successful arguments or be pseudo-questions. Thank you.
I like to say a lot about the speciation thesis and everything, but that's just too large a question for the Q&A. So I'll make a couple of minor points. First of all, I have never said anything inconsistent with any everyday belief, as far as I know.
Yes, I know you have. Correct.
I have never.
Yes.
But you said I had.
No. I said, no. I certainly, if I said that I misspoke. I said about everyday beliefs that I am not interested in them and in establishing their truth
but
or
you
falsity.
did it
But I did not attribute to you.
I think you were talking about tables and chairs and things like that. Well, anyway, if you didn't say it, you didn't say it. About everyday,
I don't believe in tables and chairs either, Peter,
about successful arguments in everyday life. Surely, in some court of law, there's been a successful argument for the conclusion that somebody embezzled money from. That would be the kind of thing I meant by a successful argument in everyday life. Now, about whether in science there are lots of arguments that meet even Plantinga's strict criterion of success. Well, I don't know. There's probably no arguments better than the arguments for the conclusion that the continents are in motion. Yet, but they didn't convince Sir Harold Jeffreys. He died believing in the geosyncline theory. Then don't oppose matter and energy. The oppositions are matter and radiation and mass and energy. Okay, fine. That's all I have to say.
Thank you.
I mean, I really would like to talk about the speciation and residual thesis, but it's too big a question.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot in your paper, really, and the last part I thought was very interesting, but also rather depressing. But never mind. I'm interested in the set of assumptions that seem to be relevant to understanding the question of whether an argument is a philosophical argument is successful. It seems to me that, on the one hand, a lot depends on the notion of an ideal audience, an ideal opponent, vis-a-vis their logical omniscience. So most of us are not, of course, logically omniscient, and we may be convinced by arguments offered by philosophers because those arguments spell out all the as it were, intermediate links between the premises, maybe with which we are acquainted, and perhaps we accept, and a conclusion that's sort of far away, and so we don't see that it is contained in those premises. And so in that respect, they work pretty well. I take it that this is what happened to you when you eventually ended up endorsing the conclusion of material beings. You know, you read through the whole thing and say, well, you know, I didn't see all those steps, now I do, and I'm happy with the conclusion. And similarly for the consequence argument and so on. So it seems to me that so long as we allow for some leeway in the logical skills, let's say, that we presuppose, then lots of arguments are, as a matter of contingent effect, successful. So that's not the interesting question, so to speak, because we're not doing sociology or psychology, etc. But then my question is this. It all boils down to the premises, I mean, to whether the argument is sound, after all. And so how is the question of whether there are successful arguments in philosophy any different from the question of whether there is any knowledge in philosophy, or even less than knowledge, but any room for, I don't know what to call it, justified belief, which of course is a question that doesn't seem to be particularly problematic in the sciences. But then it seems to me that the question boils down to this. Is there any knowledge in philosophy? Is there any progress in what we think we know in philosophy? And so it boils down to progress. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with it, with everything you said. It's clear in Peter's own discussion in the Gifford lectures, and it, I hope, should come out in my discussion, that both of us hold that there are important insights to have been gained from the examination of the implications of premises held by philosophers and others, that we are not logically omniscient, and we don't satisfy deductive closure over our beliefs, and a great deal of very important philosophy consists in revealing to us what are the implications of what we believe. And certainly this is a thesis that Peter has never questioned and long endorsed. His interest in the Gifford lectures was in establishing a particular claim about a particular argument. I think I'm probably would urge you to, or I would dissent from the conclusion that you want to saddle me with, because my paper is consistent with the claim that there are many successful philosophical arguments. We haven't gotten around to finding many of them yet, besides the ones that made themselves into arguments in mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, computer science, and psychology. But at the end of inquiry, we may decide that Peter's argument for hard determinism, right, remains with us as a successful argument, given everything else that we know, both in empirical science and in mathematics. It may also turn out to be true for the theses of material beings. I do not hold that that we ought to be pessimistic about the likelihood in the future of actually securing successful arguments for philosophical theses. I do suspect that if and when this happens, it'll turn out that they are also or now redefined or re-identified as scientific ones.
This really is a question. Does your picture of human progress have the consequence that there are no truths unknowable by humans? It seemed to me that it did, and if it did, I think it needs a philosophical argument to defend it, which you have given. But the argument seems to depend on a form of verificationism, that if we can't get there, there's no there to be got. Is that right?
Well, I certainly do not want my argument to depend on verification, because I was raised with the literacy of the falsity of verifications. But I certainly hope that there are other considerations largely to be drawn from the findings and the methods of science that will substantiate the position that I want to articulate. If it turns out that in the end, the ultimate basis for this view is some form of verificationism, then I will surrender. Well, I certainly do not want my argument to depend on verificationism, because I was raised
Hey,
with
thanks. Really interesting
with
paper.
mother's milk,
I guess
the
I was
falsity of
interested in the sense in
verifications.
which you were thinking that
but,
mathematics proceeded
I
fine
certainly
independently
hope
of
that,
questions about,
there are other
did you say the
considerations
existence of numbers,
largely
the nature of
to be
numbers?
drawn from
I mean, I guess I would have,
the findings and the
my
methods
sort of
of
naive
science
reading
that will
of the
substantiate
history, I
that
guess,
want
would
to
be things like
articulate.
set theory
If
and
it
the
turns
axiom
out
of choice at least
that
strongly
in
suggest
the end, the ultimate basis
certain
for this
views
view
about the
is
existence and
some
nature
form
of numbers,
verificationism,
various
then
facts
I will
about,
surrender.
Infinitarian mathematics suggests certain views. So, I mean, maybe you're just saying it doesn't narrow the options down to one? Okay, all right.
Of course, mathematics quantifies over numbers. So there are numbers. And the
existence of numbers, the nature of numbers,
instance as
and I
an
guess I would
example
certain views about
Okay,
the
Barry.
nature of numbers.
Thanks. That was really great. Just the first a small,
Maybe you're just saying it doesn't
just a small thing, which just
That's
went
what
on
I'm
between
saying.
you and Richard.
I'm saying,
Were
of
you
course,
saying that your view
mathematics
depends on
quantifies
there
over
being
numbers.
no
So
facts that are
there are
unknowable
numbers.
by human beings?
And the philosophical question that
I thought that's what went on.
instance as an
And I mean,
example
one of the things we know
of a question
from the
that
sciences
the
is that there
answer
are lots
to
of
which
facts.
would
I mean,
not
if anything,
advance
we
mathematical
know.
inquiry
Okay, so I'm
was
glad
the question,
that
what
nothing.
is
I
a
didn't
number?
detect that anyplace else. One thing, a couple of things came to my mind. So just one, the one argument which I tell students convinced me,
At least
and I
one
think is
person
completely
thought
right, is Hume. Hume doesn't give it quite right, but it's been developed that there's no demonstration that inductive reasoning of any kind will reliably lead to true conclusions.
I did
This
not.
seems to me completely successful.
And
I don't know whether you
no,
want to use that as an example or not.
Remember, Peter himself endorses a number of successful arguments in philosophy, and he describes them as arguments for minor philosophical theses or arguments for conclusions which themselves do not consist in the conclusion of a philosophical theory. So Hume's skeptical arguments about induction themselves, I think, Peter, perhaps will you agree or not agree, do not constitute an argument for a positive philosophical. So remember, Peter himself endorses a number
I'm not sure
of
I followed.
successful
Maybe
arguments
I
in
just
philosophy,
late in the
and
day,
he
but
describes them
here's
as
a
arguments for
claim
minor
that
philosophical
there is a
theses
reliable method
or
of
arguments
going from
for conclusions which
observational
themselves
evidence or whatever
do not consist
to
in the conclusion of a
conclusions
philosophical
beyond it,
theory.
for which we can demonstrate
So Hume's
will reliably lead us to
skeptical
truths.
arguments about
that seems to me to be a
induction,
philosophical claim.
themselves,
And it seems
I
to me that
think,
Hume
Peter,
demonstrated
perhaps
that
will you agree or not agree,
can't
do
be
not constitute
satisfied.
an
Is
argument
that
for
at
a
odds with what you
positive
just said, or
philosophical
not?
thesis of the sort
Okay.
that Peter thinks cannot be constructed. The way Peter divides up the argument.
Yeah, it hasn't it hasn't prevented philosophers to continue coming up with.
Continuously come up with hopeful solutions to Hume's problem.
Thank you so much for this. It was awesome. As my fellow grad students can attest, I especially appreciated the frequent references to Plato's awesomeness. But aside from that, I guess my question is just on this general picture you're painting, how you would consider types of philosophy that don't obviously lend themselves to empirical evidence, such as general questions in moral philosophy, philosophy of law, philosophy of race, etc., feminist philosophy. Do you think that at the end of the day, those might just boil down to be pseudo questions? Or do you think that as time progresses, we may eventually find a way to bracket them off, make them more scientific, etc.?
I have a very hard time with the normative questions in ethics and political philosophy. And I have written a very candid expression of the difficulties that I have with such questions. I am inclined to think that all of the interesting questions of institution design and of human conduct have answers, and that they're not pseudo questions. But this requires a great deal of refinement, I think, from contemporary debates. And I am also inclined to think that at least some of the claims in this domain are properly analyzed as not truth apt, as error theory or other kinds of non-descriptive claims.
That makes sense. Thanks.
But that doesn't relegate them to unimportance, meaninglessness, or inaccessibility to philosophical illumination.
Oh, yeah, so this is really just a follow-up to the exchange you had a couple of minutes ago with John about numbers. And I just sort of, I wanted to make sure I understood your answer, but I also wanted to express a couple of points of still puzzlement. So I'm actually in agreement with you that I think mathematics is not going to be affected in any way, shape, or form by metaphysics of the natural numbers. But the puzzle that I was starting with, and I think you answered this, there was a point when that question actually seemed very substantial. Back when Dedekind is writing his classic works and back around that time, there seemed to be a really real question there. So one thing I wanted to make sure is I thought your answer about this was, well, we've gone as far as we can. We've ruled out we've made the moves that were open and now we're done. Is that the?
No, because I am insufficiently expert in the domain to say with confidence that the question, what is a number, will never have an answer that has any payoff for mathematics. I might be wrong about that, okay? If it is a question, the answer to which has some payoff for mathematics, it may turn out to be one where there is a positive philosophical argument for a substantive philosophical thesis. But will that thesis then be hijacked by the mathematician? I suppose so.
I mean, I thought it was, if I have a second I thought it was worth comparing that particular question you were focusing on, which I took to be about the natural numbers, with two of its cousins that turned out to be really important to math. So one is about the nature of the real numbers, about which there was much confusion for a long time. Mm-hmm. And I think that mathematics changed substantially when that got sorted out. And also about the nature of functions, where I think we can say much the same. And so it's sort of puzzling why it is that all of these questions look to be of a family, and yet one of them seems to have lost any interest to the mathematical world where the rest didn't.
Perhaps the answer is that we've made substantive progress on the other two and not on this one, right? And now we need an explanation. And we could canvass the considerations, some of which Chalmers gave us, like we're not smart enough or we haven't been shaped by evolution in a way that would enable us to, or social forces in mathematics have driven the discipline into other lines of inquiry, right? I'm skeptical of all these.
I'm skeptical of all those too. All of those sound
explanations for why we've made no progress on this question and a lot of progress on the others. And it's also interesting to me that the genius that has been lavished on mathematics, right, has often been lavished on a subject by people who also lavished the same brain power on philosophy.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I wanted to ask about the criteria that philosophical questions are ones that science can't answer, perhaps at the end of inquiry, and perhaps many of those are pseudo-questions. So that account presupposes that we have a grip on what counts as science, and I feel like I'm of the opinion that the borders between science and philosophy are very vague and fuzzy, so I just wanted to throw out some examples and try to make problems for that and see what you say. So take like interpretations of quantum mechanics, of many worlds, hidden variables. It's conceivable that at the end of inquiry they're just always going to be empirically equivalent, but they give us radically different conceptions of reality, of like non-local action at a distance, or the world splitting off constantly. Doesn't seem like that's a pseudo-question. Or take areas of science where some scientists think it's bad philosophy, other people don't. So speculations about infinite multiverses and stuff. Some scientists think it's good science. Some scientists think, it's bad philosophy. So the scientists themselves disagree about whether that's philosophy or science. Take the more metaphysical thing, sort of metaphysics of science. So take debates about humanism, about laws of nature and things like that. So those have very indirect consequences for science. So some people think humanism has consequences for what we think about objective chance, or Tim Maudlin has argued that maybe it's in tension with quantum entanglement or whatever. So those are sort of very indirect consequences for sort of metaphysical topic of, do we reduce laws or take laws as fundamental? And other kinds of questions, like take the question, did the universe pop into existence 5 minutes ago? It's unclear whether that's a scientific question, whether science just sort of presupposes that, or whether science tells us that it didn't pop into existence 5 minutes ago. But presumably it's not a pseudo question whether the world popped into existence 5 minutes ago. So is it a philosophical question? Anyway, so all these kinds of things, multiverses, hidden variables, many worlds, humanism, worlds popping into existence, makes me sort of very unclear what the borderland is between science and philosophy. So I wanted to hear if you have a better account of that.
So you've cataloged the main questions in the philosophy of science. And I've spent my life thinking about all of those questions, not writing necessarily about them, but certainly being a consumer of writing about all of them. My general reaction to them is that the distinction between at least some or most of these questions and questions in very abstract and general science is non-existent, and that there's at least a continuum here, and that at the end of inquiry, those questions in the set that you described that have positive arguments for or for positive theses with theories behind them will eventually be embraced by scientists and others, whether they call themselves philosophers or not. You and I are in no position at this point to adjudicate among all those questions that you addressed, but I think we both agree that at least some of them are real questions and not pseudo questions. Yeah. And I think we also agree that at least a few of them really are pseudo. Okay?
Not sure about that.
Thank you. So this is a follow-up to the last question, and it was sort of...
Which was a great question.
Yeah. So I thought that this was sort of a borderline case, and I wasn't sure like if you'd be okay with just calling it both philosophy and science. So take like, I'm a Quinean about ontology, right?
Yeah, I did mention Quine, but that's who I was channeling in answering your question.
Yeah, but like if I'm a Quinean about ontology, I'm going to think, and say I think the best theory is fundamental physics then, I'm going to think that science is going to determine what I think exists. So that seems like it's simultaneously a philosophical and scientific endeavor. Are you okay with that? That's really
Yes.
the main question. You're okay with labeling them both, and it's fine, it's just a continuum.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's just, it's a purely a labeling problem.
Thank you so much. This was a really, really wonderful, wonderful talk. This is basically just piggybacking on David's question, but all of these issues that have just been cataloged in the philosophy of science strike me as, well, I don't know about all of them, but a lot of them strike me as the kinds of questions where one could, though I would definitely think one shouldn't, dismiss them as being pseudo-questions in what strike me as a structurally very similar way to the way that some dismiss certain metaphysical questions as being pseudo-questions. So, for example, I remember, I'm just reminded me of this exchange between another David, Albert, and some physicists who I forgot. They were talking about high dimensionalism, which is a very, it strikes me as just a very paradigm case of a non-pseudo question. Is physical space three-dimensional or a Google dimensional? But then, the physicist sort of said, oh yeah, but I can translate between this mathematical language and that mathematical language, and there's no, privileged description and things like that. And it does sort of strike me as somewhat structurally analogous to, like, do past entities exist? Well, I have this, if you have a deflationary enough conception of existence, that comes off as a kind of a pseudo question. And I'm just wondering, I guess I'm just wondering what our criteria are here for. I mean, I might be asking too general and unfair of a question here, but when given examples like that, when are we justified in taking kind of maybe on the more very metaphysical end of this questions about, say, the existence of past entities or the existence of tables or things like that, or maybe you wouldn't take those questions to be pseudo questions. Anyway, that may have not been a helpful question.
I think that my criterion for pseudo versus non-pseudo is going to have some kind of a combination of a pragmatic and an explanatory component. That is, it's going to have to make a difference for inquiry, the answer to a question, okay? And inquiry is directed primarily and fundamentally, and this is why I'm a metaphysician and have been one ever since I began to learn what it was really about at Peter's knee. It's primarily an explanatory inquiry, okay? And that's why metaphysics wears the pants and not epistemology, because explanation is the fundamental challenge that our discipline faces, along with all the sciences. What Aristotle said, you know, philosophy begins with wonder, right? And the other component is there's only one way to decide on whether a purported explanation is actually explanatory or merely scratches the itch of curiosity and reduces the psychological discomfort that we have without actually contributing to knowledge. And that's going to be some kind of a pragmatic component, some kind of a practical predictive consequence from the explanation. But that's going to be, could be extremely distant, okay? And it's certainly going to allow for the kind of metaphysics that goes on in this university as an integral and indispensable part of scientific inquiry.
Well, you'll be I'll have you on my shoulders next time.
Okay.
All right. Well, we've reached the end.
Thank you.